Oh my God. Hi, everyone. Indie Rock Tano here, the internet's busiest music nerd, and it's time for indie rock, a genre of music and an era of culture that personally I have a lot of ties to. Given that this genre's commercial ascent in the mid to late 2000s, early 2010s was about the time that, I started reviewing music on YouTube and really cutting my teeth as a critic, if you want to use the C word, filthy word, disgusting word, terrible word. Well, anyway, one thing that saddens me about this time period is that increasingly every year, personally, I've found that there are fewer and fewer places to go to actually get, a good, decent, accurate historical assessment of what happened, when it happened, why it happened, and what made it significant for reasons that will be discussed in this video. But an interesting and I think great fix for this problem is this book right here next to my head, Such Great Heights from Chris DeVille, The Complete Cultural History of the Indie Rock Explosion. Now, Chris, if you're unfamiliar, is the managing editor over at Stereogum, a publication we have referenced on our YouTube channels many a time, and for good reason. They have and continue to do great stuff in the music space. And Chris really has put together a pretty detailed retelling of many of the major cultural touchstone moments, the artists, the albums, the publications that made it what it was, and puts it together into this very easy to read book, which we will link you guys to down below. And all of this is the reason why I thought it would be important to bring on Chris for a conversation, which is exactly what we are going to do as I interview him about this book, his process, and indie rock and pop at large. So let's do it. All right, Chris, thank you for coming on and taking the time.
Thank you so much for having me. Great privilege.
All right. So let's get into maybe what indie rock is as a concept and as an ethos, to what degree it does have one, I guess you could say, because I feel like, the era of music in which you're kind of like lifting off from, late 90s, early 2000s, it is an era of indie that is, as you know, kind of like coming back aesthetically in a lot of ways. I mean, as you kind of like mentioned in the book, a lot of people are kind of looking back on this era and seeing some artists revive it and referring to it as like indie sleaze, even though like at the time when we were kind of like listening to these artists and they were relevant to our youth, that's not what we were calling it. It's almost like a
Right.
retrospective label. But let's try to take it out of, I don't know, this almost like bird's eye view, catch all term that people are kind of like categorizing it as right now. And, look at it in a more kind of like granular way and explain to anybody who might be new or uninitiated what exactly like indie is or was intended to be per se.
Yeah. So that's definitely like a through line of the book is sort of the way that the word indie has changed over the years and how its meaning has been tugged in a bunch of different directions.
Mm.
But yeah, where I start in the book is, you're right, like around sort of late 90s, early 2000s, and because that was my entry point with indie rock. And I do spend the first chapter sort of trying to speed run like what was indie rock in the 80s and 90s, like sort of what was it when I first encountered it. And so yeah, there's like, even back then, as I was trying to sort through this, the history of it, like even back in the 90s, I don't know if there was a totally coherent definition, because like theoretically it's just music that is released on an independent label or released with no record label at all,
Right.
not on a major label. I mean, that is by definition independent rock music, which is where the term indie comes from. But even like Lou Barlow had the song Gimme Indie Rock, and that came out in, I think, 1990. And even at that point, I feel like there was an aesthetic associated with indie rock. Like I talk about this later in the book when I get into sort of the indie audience's relationship with rap music. like something could be independently released rap music, but it wouldn't necessarily be like backpack rap or like there was a certain style of rap music that was associated with indie rap. Even though like 3 6 Mafia at first was independent,
Right.
it sounded nothing like Common. And so in the same way, it's like indie rock was an aesthetic as much as it was like an objective description of like the method of release, the mechanism of release. So you had sort of runoff from the punk and post-punk moment. You had certainly, if you want to go all the way back to the 60s, you got the Velvet Underground, you got the Stooges, you got sort of the rise of, once rock and roll became the mainstream in the 60s, we had sort of, an underground forming then, and, carries on all the way. You've got sort of the influence of music critics kind of developing more of an elitist kind of artsy fartsy taste as opposed to like the more popular populist taste. You've got in the 80s, you got the rise of college radio, sort of providing a literal alternative on the radio. And then of course you had like the grunge explosion because Nirvana and all of them came from this underground rock world that certainly was associated with indie. So a lot of it would probably self-identify as indie rock. And so,
Yeah, I mean, their Bleached like came out through Sub Pop Records, which
right,
I
yeah,
mean,
exactly.
is like pretty much one of the most relevant indie labels that there is.
Yeah, so this explosion that I'm talking about in the book, it's definitely not the first time that indie rock has ever crossed over. But I was looking at sort of how these sort of millennial indie bands, uh, how how they differed from what happened when like Nirvana and all of the kind of Lollapalooza era alternative rock thing was happening. And what I found was that like it seemed like all the bands from like the OC era, like you've got like Death Cab and the Shins. There was sort of this like wave of poppy bands. Like there was this whole reaction, I think, against loud, heavy music in the late 90s in the underground, just because of what sort of evolved out of grunge. All the sort of like new metal and butt rock type stuff that happened in the late 90s. I'm thinking about like Korn, Limp Bizkit, Creed. There's just stuff that was on mainstream rock radio and MTV when I was in high school.
Which I mean, you yourself talk about in the book, like being a fan of.
Yes. I mean, I liked that. I still like some of that stuff, but like,
Yeah.
I was also partially engaging with it because like I wanted to be relevant. Like I wanted to be able to, engage with my peers. Uh,
Mm.
but I did really like some of it too. And so yeah, I think obviously from my rambling answer, you can tell like even back then, I'm not sure that there was like a super clear and coherent definition of what is indie rock, but it definitely seems like if we're going with sort of a 90s definition, it's sort of scrappy, maybe lo-fi, but certainly like not ultra polished, um, coming off of the influence of punk and post-punk, but maybe not with totally the same amount of aggression, a little bit collegiate. Um, but even within that definition, there's just like so much room for variation. And then, as the concept of indie just kept expanding and being co-opted and being stretched, it's like, uh, I don't know. I think we're at a point now where you could ask 5 different people who say they like indie music to name a few of their favorite artists, and you would probably get different lists.
Oh yeah, you would get totally different lists. I mean, if there's a way that I could kind of like encapsulate this book, and I don't know if anybody has like explained it like this so far, I feel like under the flag and under the guise of indie, and you've kind of had to cast a wide net in order to do this effectively. I feel like what you've done for a certain time period, like you've sort of mapped out and, really kind of like reverse engineered the DNA strands of what is like underground music for a certain time period.
Yeah.
It's just that for this time period, we more or less like referred to it as indie, or audiences that predominantly saw themselves consuming indie also consumed a host of other things that maybe wouldn't have been categorized as that, but they were still successful within the demographics and audiences of people who primarily consider themselves to be like indie music consumers.
Yeah.
And you were able to sort of like, map out again the way those tastes shifted from certain trends, certain sounds, from that scrappy lo-fi rock music, from grunge, like you were talking about, going forward to a lot of the blog house type pop and electronic music that was like, popping up when Pitchfork was having to culturally balance its relevance with people who were like starting up random music websites, be it either Stereo Gum or Brooklyn Vegan or Gorilla versus Bear, so on and so forth. And then also kind of like jumping on top of that into like different, and this is like the era in which I was like mostly ingrained with this, talking about different micro trends like chill wave and,
Hmm.
lo-fi and glo-fi, and the way that was like kind of taking shape in, the early 2010s and late 2000s. But then beyond that, we also sort of see you mapping out how that need for an alternative voice and perspective and aesthetic also kind of like getting a lot of fans to dive deeply into hip hop music, and sort
Hmm.
of almost like detach from rock music entirely. There's a part in the book where you talk about, how for a lot of underground music audiences, it was almost more alternative or more indie to be more infatuated with rap and R&B than it was like rock music itself. So, it's like you're kind of like mapping out all of these different underground tastes and trends while simultaneously detailing the way in which we've sort of like come to understand indie and indie aesthetics, because it sort of went from this like catch-all term, as you just said, for artists who are just kind of like, releasing music independently, to this sort of branded, clear, defined sound and aesthetic that people kind of got a notion of by virtue of the mainstream exposure it was getting around the time through music released, on the OC, the frickin' OC, like mix sound and the volume mixes from the TV show, and also Garden State and Juno and, so on and so forth, because these were like landmark moments in terms of like any independent considered indie categorized artist getting some actual mainstream attention. And, I mean, as somebody who was like, and I think, again, this is part of why the book is so good. As somebody who was like so deeply ingrained into a lot of that stuff, that I was hip to a lot of those artists or artists that sounded like those artists by the time those things were popping off, that those moments didn't necessarily define the genre for me,
Yeah.
but like it did for a lot of people who were less clued in. And as a result, like, there were a lot of trending sounds and things that I didn't necessarily have a grasp of because I wasn't, watching that TV show. I wasn't like actually, I wasn't actually like, getting my mind blown by Garden State or, into that. I mean, I did love Juno when it came out. But I wasn't really like as crazy about those films when they came out, but a lot of people were, and they sort of like introduced people to the sound and this idea that they hadn't considered otherwise, because it was like, the primary exposure point, these Apple iPod, ads too, which like, became a huge liftoff point for, projects and groups like Chairlift,
Right.
back in the day.
Yeah, and I think the points of mainstream exposure and sort of the interaction between the mainstream and indie rock was the thing that I was really trying to zero in on with the book. So it's true, there is a lot of the history of sort of late 2000s, early 2010s indie rock, that where the indie rock itself kind of gets grazed over in the book. I was actually, when I was writing the book, the subtitle that I had in mind for it was How Indie Rock Went Pop.
Hmm.
And I sort of was starting from that 2010s moment and working my way backward. Like, it was like, how did we get to the point where uh, the quote unquote indie audience is more interested in Danny Brown and Charlie XCX than like whatever guitar band is popping off.
Hmm.
And or even like I I think, the last thing I talk about in the book, or one of the last things, is when Taylor Swift made Folklore, and she made it with Aaron Dessner from The National,
Right.
and everybody referred to it as her indie album. And it's like, so if the new Taylor Swift album that, is the biggest album of the year and wins album of the year at the Grammys, and like is a Taylor Swift album, is considered indie, uh, then like how can the term even mean anything
Yeah, yeah.
now?
What isn't indie at that point? Yeah.
Yeah, so I was like, I had that as kind of like a point to work backwards from, like, how did we get to that point? Or like, how did we get to the point where like Carly Rae Jepsen plays Pitchfork Music Festival and is like considered like sort of a fixture of the same musical universe where like Swans is popular. Like, so yeah, those were sort of the some of the guideposts that I was using to figure out what I was going to cover and what I was going to include. And so yeah, that definitely meant hitting on a lot of those mainstream touch points, like you said, like the TV shows, the movies, the commercials, and just the stuff that a lot of people would be able to remember. Like, I mean, my hope was that people who were deep into indie music during this time would enjoy the book, but also that people who maybe weren't that deep into indie music at this time could read the book and say like, "Oh yeah, I remember AOL Instant Messenger. I remember MySpace. I remember the OC. I remember Urban Outfitters. I mean, obviously Urban Outfitters is still around. Maybe it's better to say I remember American Apparel, but like, yeah. So that
Well,
was
I
the
mean,
hope.
I think all of that stuff is even more important for people who don't remember, because
Hmm.
I think for a lot of younger potential readers for this book, it may seem alien to them, the idea, the way that sort of like the media landscape has shifted, that something as maybe what they perceive to be as insignificant as like a 30-second television advertisement would have such a profound effect on some underground rock band's career. That somebody in passing would catch such a thing and then actually be like, what is that? I need to look that up. Like that a random ad on TV could all of a sudden overnight drive interest in Nick Drake's Pink Moon. For
Right.
example, which I mean, is not necessarily strictly an indie thing, but I believe back then it was like there was a moment, I think it was like a car ad. I believe it was a
Right.
car advertisement that like, had Pink Moon in it literally.
Hmm.
And, it was actually played incessantly back in the day when they first launched it on TV. And it was played so often and exposed so many people to Nick Drake's music that wouldn't have heard it otherwise. But I mean, I guess like maybe the most analogous thing these days is like when you hear a random sound popping off on TikTok or something, and it's like maybe involving a joke or a reference or a trend that might cater to your interests or might be relevant to you in some way, but you're hearing the song connected to it that is within its context for whatever reason that it is. And it's that sort of introduction that gets you thinking like, well, I really think this joke or this reference is funny or whatever this is originally, but what is the song that's connected to? I need to go look that up. So, people are kind of getting exposed to these indie artists that had no other means of like breaking out of the other underground other than something like this. And they were just getting placed into these ads. And, you also kind of talk about in the book, like I guess like in a way, a bit of an economic and an ethos shift that happened over that course of time, because prior, in the 80s and 90s and even before that, like, sort of doing something like aligning your song or your music or your art with a brand in that overt a way was almost like kind of like forbidden. It was seen as like this terrible sellout thing. You were cheapening your art and your music and everything. And now that's almost like kind of to be expected at this point.
Yeah, definitely. There was a lot of changing attitudes about selling out that I tried to track in the
Mm.
book, and I sort of use Steve Albini, the late Steve Albini, as like sort of the voice of the old underground attitude about selling out. But then, yeah, it became, I think, just harder and harder to make a living and as a musician. And so I think that there was sort of an understanding, a collective understanding that like, people got to do what they got to do, and maybe we don't have like the grounds to, maybe we don't need to be quite so strict about policing these things. But at the same time, this is happening at the same time as poptimism, which like I don't, I really tried. I don't know how many of your viewers are engaging in the poptimism wars or are familiar with that term. And I really didn't want the book to be like an anti-poptimism screed, because you can
Hmm.
find a new one of those online every day. But it definitely, so poptimism, the nutshell version of it is just the idea that some of the inherited conventional wisdom of good taste and music critics was flawed and biased, and it was rejecting certain genres, uh, like just because, like if it's the music that a teenage girl might like, then it's like not as significant as like what a 40-year-old white man might like. And so like, dance pop is fluff and rap music is, so there were all these, basically the idea was that all music deserves a fair shake, and that like some of the quote unquote important music might not be as good as people say it is, and some of the quote
Hmm.
unquote unimportant music, might have more value than you're giving it credit for. But the sort of the way that that worked in practice was a lot of hipsters who really defined themselves previously by sort of a strictly underground music taste, suddenly like really loving Justin Timberlake. And so there, yeah, I think that impacted the attitudes around selling out as well, because if it was like, if pop was suddenly like the edgy cool new thing to like, then moving closer to sort of that pop star world, it didn't have quite the same taboo around it that it used to.
Hmm. Let me ask you, because this is another kind of point that I think you address in the book, and I don't know if you can like really speak to this beyond your own personal experience here and the way that you present yourself as a music fan. But at one point, especially early in the book, you talk about indie almost as like an identity or a style or something that a lot of fans engaged in as a means of like having an identity of sorts, and for sure, like indie music is by no means like the only style or genre of music culture that does this. I mean, like punks and metalheads and certain stripes of hip hop fans dress a certain way to like represent themselves within the musical culture that they operate within. But like from your own personal standpoint, there are moments where you like admit to, yeah, maybe to a degree, I was being like a little performative here, and liking certain things or engaging or endorsing certain things because of what I felt like it represented about me, and especially with all this dialogue on TikTok right now about like performative males, and like whether or not guys are into certain things because it makes them look a certain way to be into it. Like at this point, at your old ass age, not to be rude, I mean we're in the same ballpark on that front. But to what degree now do you feel like this music sits for you in terms of I enjoy this as a fan, I enjoy this purely for the musical value of it, but simultaneously this says something about who I am as a person, and where do you feel like that balance is for you now? Are you totally beyond the performativity? Was the performativity an important element of it early on? Is it something that you look back on now as like, oh man, I shouldn't have been into that for the look of it, at the time?
I think definitely being able to define myself as an indie rock fan appealed to me back then a lot. It was like I did love the music. Like it wasn't just like, oh, here's an identity that I can put on, that's going to differentiate me from my peers. So like when I was first getting into indie rock, it was like the Pixies, really great band, Pavement, amazing band, changed my life, literally changed, the way I hear music. And so like there was an aspect of like a big aspect of it was like, wow, I can't believe these bands exist and I'd never heard of them before. And there's this whole universe of bands to explore that like aren't getting the same attention as whatever's on the radio and MTV. And so that was exciting and it was fun. And I had so many thrilling experiences listening to music, just driving around in my car with nowhere to go or like, downloading on Napster or whatever. I had a genuine love for the music, but there was definitely a part of me that was like the superiority complex appealed to me as well, where it was like I was used to being kind of the nerd, kind of like, certainly not anywhere near the top of the high school social chain. And I think that the idea that like a different kind of cool existed where it was like knowing about things that other people didn't know about and sort of like existing as sort of people's Sherpa into this whole other subculture. Like that
Hmm.
was appealing to me too. And so there was definitely like a snobbishness. I think a lot of the reviews I was reading at the time too were like a lot of the writing about indie rock that I was reading in the early 2000s was reinforcing those kinds of ideas, sort of like the hipster superiority complex. And like I say this in the book, like hipster for me, I did kind of aspire to be a hipster, but I thought that maybe I was like too inherently like basic to fully achieve the hipster status. But yeah, I think as life has gone on, I'm 42 now. Um, I think there's an element of just like getting older. There's certainly like having kids. Um, you lose a lot of ego when you become a parent.
Hmm.
Like you can't really project. You can't project some sort of false coolness. But at the same time, I think like we as a culture with social media, we've sort of trained ourselves to project like a certain version of ourselves, a persona out to the world. And so I don't think that that's completely left me behind. Like certainly there are some things that where I like put it out there just because I really love. Like if I'm talking about a band that I love, it's like it's literally my job to tell people about cool new bands.
Hmm.
And there's real genuine enthusiasm that I'm bringing to that job.
Hmm.
Uh, but like, I think that there's still an element of curation, sort of to like, here's the artist that I'm going to publicly like really ride for and take a stand for. And certainly that part of that is like, this is how I want to present myself. Like, uh, so I like to think that I've matured past the like music fandom as an identity. And I think that I have, but I don't think any of us can totally get away from uh, sort of our cultural pull towards like sort of the presenting the curated Pinterest board that is my personality.
You know, just as a quick aside here, because I don't, I think it is kind of like a funny thought experiment. I mean, how much at this point have you been able to, or have you, um, maybe sort of like shared in this side of like your music taste and your life with your kids? I mean, while nothing musically or experientially like happens in a vacuum completely and entirely, um, I do feel like that, obviously there is probably like a bit of a temptation there in terms of like, in terms of like showing this music to somebody, this is maybe as blank as a slate I'm going to get. You know what I mean? It's like, they're children. They're not going to have any of these sort of like weird cultural biases in terms of like, oh, if you do like this, it means this, or if you don't like this, it means this. It's like, have you had any experiences where you're like, I'm going to see if my kids are as into pavement as I am, and as into pavement as I am, and maybe that'll mean something. If they could sort of enjoy this completely out of the context of what it was maybe meant to be enjoyed and still see merit in it, then maybe there's something to it beyond sort of like the cultural context in which people were excited about it.
I've definitely tried to expose my kids to the music I love. my wife isn't really an indie music fan.
Mm.
Like there's there's a very small like Venn diagram overlap with the indie bands that we both like, and so like there's a fair amount of Vampire Weekend played around the house, and certain things there's certain ones that she'll like maybe isn't enthusiastic about, but she'll tolerate like sort of the more accessible, easy listening side of things like the National or like Haim or something. But like so. I have definitely like tried to play Pavement, tried to get them into like sort of the pillar bands of my life, like the Wilco, Radiohead type bands. And honestly, like I find that kids very early on do have pretty strong opinions about what they like. Like there's children's music for a reason. Like they really gravitate towards children's music, and they're just getting to the age now where like my oldest just turned 10 this summer. And so they're just getting to the age where maybe some more grown-up music is starting to appeal to them. Like they kind of entered through the doorway of pop, but they're kind of working their way out from there. I had a sort of a viral tweet about playing the Geese album for my family in the car and how they all kind of like revolted against it. And uh, so like there's definitely limits to what they will accept. And I don't think that I've gotten to the point of like there's that Onion article where it's like cool dad is ensuring his daughter will be socially alienated, and he's like by passing off his music taste on
Right.
her, and he's handing her a copy of Talking Heads Remain in Light. It's like I don't think that my children have allowed for that to happen. And so maybe I guess someone could make the case that like because the kids don't gravitate towards it, that means that like it was all performative, and like the indie rock wasn't actually that good. Only K-pop Demon Hunters is good.
I think there is almost like a leapfrog generational pattern that happens because like with a lot of the people, I mean, maybe within the age range that you're talking about, like, no, but like within the age range of people who I interact with the most or interact with my videos the most and sort of like will hit me up and are on the younger side, because I've found with the years that I've done this, there are some viewers and people who sort of like, watch what I do and they stick around for a while. But I have found more often than not, because of the sort of like range of music that I find myself covering, and just kind of trying to stay on top of things that are new and current and so on and so forth, like things do kind of continue to, even after doing this for 10 years, stay around that I would say like 16 to 30 range, so now I am like being viewed by people who are much younger than me for the most part. And I do sort of like, have these 18-year-olds telling me, or even a little younger, who will hit me up and just be like, yeah, man, I'm really into Sonic Youth. My dad put me onto them. And I'll just be like, what? And their dad's a little older than me. You know what I mean? So I do think there is like, maybe a bit of an intergenerational thing kind of going on in terms of like, music being passed down, but it almost like, skips the generation previous to it because, for that time period, that's almost the era of music that we're moving away from and getting over, because we just experienced it. So it can't be cool immediately after it's like kind of gone stale. We have to wait a little bit for people to kind of go back and then sort of like be put onto it later down the road after it's kind of like lost its flavor and then can kind of be reset a little bit. But with that, I did want to ask, like, one of the great things that I think your book does, and I feel like is necessary, and maybe you have a better lay of the land in terms of like who else has done this or tried to do something similar to this. I mean, I know there are other publications out there like Meet Me in the Bathroom, for example, which covered, like a lot of that underground rock in the New York scene around a similar period. Obviously, you're looking at a much kind of like broader, wider net that's being cast in terms of like the different eras and subsections of underground music that are being covered during this time period. But simultaneously, as somebody who lived through this era, enjoyed a lot of the music of this era, covered a lot of the music on the tail end of this era, has followed a lot of publications that kind of like cut their teeth and made a name for themselves talking about the music of this era. When I think about how all of that has shifted today, I find myself referencing this time period less and less. I see a lot of the publications that sort of I became familiar with through this time period talking about a lot of this music less and less. That could change in the next 5 to 6 years as maybe some of it becomes like, relevant again and people are kind of getting nostalgic, which I think, your book is kind of like landing in an interesting period for potentially, but I digress. Um, but simultaneously, despite all of that stuff feeling so big and so relevant and so important at the time, I mean, even Ryan Schreiber was like a Time Person of the Year because of how much influence he had on people's record collections, as the magazine said at the time. Um, Simultaneously, it sort of seems like in the immediate sense, we've all become like, and Stereogum's definitely an exception for this, compliment to you guys. But I think a lot of us have been just very bad stewards for this time period in terms of like maintaining what was important about it and the great stuff that happened during it. Often I find myself like kind of wondering, like, do any of these kids know who the fuck Grizzly Bear is? Like, and they made some incredible records that, I feel like still covertly, especially when you look at like production on records like Yellow House, like have an impact today in terms of like what certain, instrumental palettes sound like and feel like in modern music. To what do you kind of like, attribute to the fact that like a lot of our history and a lot of our reference points and the cultural dialogue around this era sort of like dying on the vine a little bit? Because I mean, if anybody who is younger now is curious about this time period, and again, I'm thankful that this book exists because now people can sort of like look at this and get a real sense, at least in a bird's eye view sort of way, of like what happened during this time period and get those major touchstone moments. But, outside of something like this, I feel like there's not a lot of options for many kids on the internet now. If they're like, what the hell is all this indie shit and what happened during this time period and why is it important? There's just like a lack of resources and places to go to get that. And why do you think that is?
I mean, I think a lot of it is just because of like the rot of the internet. Like, so much of, I mean, that's part of the reason I wrote the book is because I wanted there to be like a more permanent record of some of this stuff because I feel like so much of what I covered here was first documented on blogs that don't exist anymore,
Hmm.
uh, on social media posts, message boards. I mean, there's just so much that you can only access through the Wayback Machine, like sort of archives of dead links. Um, and it was a very online thing, but we haven't been very good as a culture about preserving literature and that happened online. Like, so yeah, there haven't been, I don't think, too many books engaging with this era. I mean, like you said, Meet Me in the Bathroom. That's that definitely gives you lots of information about what happened in the New York scene, and that was a huge part of what was happening in the early part of this book as well. They're very different kinds of books though, because this, that's an oral history where she interviewed like hundreds of people about their experiences and then sort of stacked up their quotes so that all the characters are telling the story.
Right.
And my book is more like heavily researched cultural criticism. Like there's tons of quotes in the book, but they're mostly like sort of collaged together from a bunch of different sources. And then they're mixed in with my own personal experience. Uh, but yeah, I mean, it's like I know Greg Kot, the Chicago music critic and one of the hosts of Sound Opinions, the podcast. He had a book called Ripped that came out in like 2009 that was sort of like the immediate boots on the ground reporting on how the internet and technology had changed music in the 2000s, basically. Uh, and so that takes you up to 2009. But the 2010s really is like one of the main reasons I chose this subject because I was like, we haven't really seen a lot of books covering the 2010s and sort of how the indie boom of the 2000s, sort of what that wrought in the 2010s. There is a new book. There's a British author, Liam Insco Jones. He just wrote a book called Songs in the Key of MP3. And it's really about 2010s. It's five really long chapters that are just each one's basically a profile of one artist. It's like Blood Orange, FKA Twigs, um, One O Tricks Point Never. I forget what the other two are off the top of my head, but like basically just explaining sort of what the indie mainstream became in the 2010s when it was like not really indie rock, so to speak, but indie became, more of like a catch-all for a bunch of different sounds that, like you said, a certain audience more so than a certain sound.
Hmm.
And so his book is really cool, and I recommend that. That's one of the first books that I've seen that really tackles indie music in the 2010s. But yeah, so I think that the fact that so much of the record of this stuff from the internet is fading away and being lost to time, that was a big driver for wanting to write the book.
Yeah, in retrospect, it feels almost like a cultural .com bubble in a way because of how hot and intensely popular and maybe in our own minds like relevant it all felt at the time. And because of how permanent the internet felt in some ways, like, oh, I post this and it's just there. I don't need to worry about sort of like framing it or storing it anywhere or da 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 da. It's just kind of there. And I can easily look it up on Google and find it in 30 seconds. Like, because of all of that ease, I think a lot of us were under a false presumption that like we didn't need to worry about where it was going to go, in
Yeah.
the next 10 years. And now, like, as you say, like a lot of that stuff is like dead links, the pipelines through which you would look that stuff up or find it. You're either talking about like shoddy website search, interfaces, or, search engines themselves that are now packed with like AI slop. And to actually find the sort of information that you're looking for, you're talking about digging 3, 4, 5 pages deep because everything that's on top is like, just bot generated shit that's confusing or stuff that's like really recent about any of this stuff. And it's not giving you like a more context or a back history.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate. It's like, supposed to be the information superhighway, but it's not nearly as it just feels like a big mess out there. It's harder and harder to get to real information. So yeah, it's unfortunate that like a lot of the stuff that we thought, oh well, it's online, so I can always go back to that link. Uh, it's true, those are gone, and a lot of the, like you said, the sort of pathways that the music would even find its way to an audience has gone away, like in terms of sort of social media replacing the blogs, like a lot of the commentary, the discourse that would happen in comment sections of blogs sort of moved over to the Twitter timeline, and with streaming coming in too. I mean, all these factors created a situation where there was less of like a centralized, like in the 2000s, what developed with blogs and Pitchfork and sort of the whole hype cycle around indie rock was there was actually like a pathway for artists to get launched to a sustainable career for a while. And I mean, that even then it was like you had people getting launched who weren't ready to be launched,
Mm.
and then their career didn't really sustain, or it was like the constant need for the hot new thing. It meant that like a band had their 15 minutes and then kind of went back to not being buzzed about anymore. I remember the band from, I live in Columbus, Ohio, and there's this band Times New Viking, a lo-fi band. Uh,
Yeah, I remember them and how you talk about them being mastered loud on the album. And I remember when the lo-fi thing was the trend, they had one of the loudest records out, like point blank
yeah,
period.
yeah, it was so intense. And they had like a moment when they got best new music on Pitchfork for their third album in 2008, and they had kind of some hype around them, and they were friends with this other band from Columbus called Psychedelic Horseshit.
I
That
remember
was,
them too. Yeah.
yeah, and and there was another band called Pink Reason that was operating in those circles, and they all kind of jokingly came up with the term shit gaze to describe their musical style. But those bands just had like a 1 to 2 year window where it was like there was a lot of hype around them. But then I remember I was writing for the weekly newspaper in Columbus at the time. A few years on from their big hype moment, Times New Viking was just back to playing, not very large club shows on tour. And so it was like even then, the machinery that was in place, the mechanisms that were in place to launch bands to stardom, it wasn't like it guaranteed a sustainable career, but there was sort of like a I like there's a guy Pranav Troon who has written for Stereogum some, and he wrote about the book for his newsletter, and he talked about an underground mainstream, and it's like it feels like there's less of that now. Like it's so fragmented and fractured, and everybody's in their own little bubble, and some of that has to do with algorithms, and like it doesn't seem like there's necessarily like a center of indie music, so to speak. Like you're you might as well be the closest thing to the center. Like uh so yeah, it's kind of a weird time now. Uh and it you're right that the stuff that gets written about in the book, it probably does seem like a historical relic to somebody who's younger and just coming into this stuff.
Um, I know you got to get going. I want to ask you one more thing before you head out. Again, I know we could like dive deeper into this stuff all day, but look, to anybody who's watching, again, check this book out. The history is deep. The details are there. If you want to know anything more about anything that we're talking about, believe me, it is in this book in more detail and more everything. But with that, this is why I want to kind of like ask you this final question about looking forward a little bit, because it again, you sort of like cover indie going pop in a way and like alternative tastes going pop in the way that's like manifested in a lot of different mainstream trends. But I feel like the latest thing right now, at least, in my own perspective, for the first time in a long time, through Geese and through all these different bands that I know that you're aware of, that like a lot of people are kind of categorizing right now as like windmill scene, a lot of these groups and bands that are coming out of, these areas right now are pretty hot. Like, when I look at certain reviews that I put out, like these are the most views that I've gotten on like underground rock records in a long time. And, after kind of like peeping all of this and kind of documenting all of it, where do you feel like this trend is coming from? Like where is this coming from to where it all of a sudden sort of seems, maybe not in a broad scale, but at least with these groups specifically, it's kind of coming across like underground rock is hip again and it's cool again. What are these bands doing and what is it defining from your perspective?
I think that, I mean, there is always a pendulum swing, right? So like
Right.
it swings so far one direction, then people will uh sort of get tired of so we had in the late 2000s sort of indie bands getting synthy, and then like you had the rise of the indie pop star, and uh then I feel like in the 2010s you sort of had a little bit of like guitars are back, but at the same time the artists that were really blowing up were sort of like a hybrid between an indie rocker and a pop star. I think about somebody like Mitski.
Mm.
She's like she doesn't really fit into any category, but there's an aspect of like pop stan, like loyalty in her fandom,
Yeah, which
and
for sure is like still going on right now through like the Jay Breckys or the Claros
yeah,
of the world
yeah,
currently. Yeah.
right. And you got like you had Phoebe Bridgers, and then you had like a countless wannabe Phoebe Bridgerses, and so you had sort of like a this soft, clean uh type of over not overly processed, because I like a lot of that music, but like I think that maybe somebody who wanted to critique that side of indie music, it's like we went in sort of a streaming friendly, not going to rock anybody's playlist. Like, I mean, to bring back Times New Viking, I talk in the book about how they couldn't be on the Scott Pilgrim soundtrack because they're not playlist friendly.
Right.
It's like their song comes on and it's jarring, like it takes you out of your like your flow state where while you're working on your coding or whatever um and so I think that people just kind of got tired of this sort of safe and accessible music. And I do think that there is a hunger for music that is a little bit weirder, a little bit more challenging, a little bit more abrasive. So Geese would certainly be part of that because, I mean, you really have to get on Cameron's wavelength in terms of the way he sings.
Mm.
I mean, even Wednesday, like there's a fairly wide range of sounds happening on Wednesday albums, but like in general, they're loud and noisy, and Carly's voice is like not for everyone, and it's like kind of piercing, and she's not afraid to scream, and she's not afraid to be a little out of tune. And
Mm.
I think people are responding to music that is sort of not afraid to be raw and make sort of take bold swings. So that could be something to it. It's like it's not sort of the sanitized. That's the word I was looking for, was sanitized. Um, it's not sanitized streaming bait. I think it's related to, we've been hearing about with the whole indie sleaze thing, people romanticizing Y2K aesthetics because it's like a time before everything was online, a time when people could just party and they didn't have to worry that like, video of them partying was gonna, be all over the feed. Um, and sort of romanticizing the messiness of that 2000s time in general. And so I think that, what's happening with the popularity for some of these a little bit gnarlier indie bands is related to that.
Yeah, I mean, if anything, I feel like it can be gleaned from your book and kind of like brought into today is that regardless of what kind of like paradigm that we're in, you're always going to have an audience of people, to whatever degree they are, like looking or searching, seeking out some kind of undercurrent, beyond all of it, that like maybe says something a little bit more than what they're getting at the tippy top of sort of like, the music industry, regardless of what like shape or flavor or trends are like prevailing at the time. And, it happens that, for this time period that you're covering here, like it was this sound, it was this style, it was this aesthetic. And, we're just like always going to be constantly having to just always adjust and sort of like learn whatever that new language or sort of like, new alternative, new counterculture is musically, regardless of like what era we're in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's always going to be some sort of genuine disruptor, to use a word that's like, I feel like it's a captured word. It's just kind of like corporate speak now to say disruption. But like
Yeah,
when you,
it's a tech bro,
but
it's a tech bro forum thing.
but there always, I think, is going to be every few years a few bands or artists that come along that genuinely do shake things up, and then obviously you're going to have a bunch of followers in their wake. Like I think that the wannabe Geese copycat bands are going to be excruciating. But yeah, I mean, I think we just got to a point where indie music needed a shakeup, and there were some artists that were talented and brave enough to be weird, basically. And so we'll see where things go from here.
All right, Chris. Well, I appreciate you again documenting it and all the time and effort that you put into this book. We're going to link to it and your Substack and everything else related to you down below in the D box. And once more, appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks so much for having me on. It means a lot.
All right, guys. Thank you very much for watching that conversation. Appreciate you being here. Put indie rock in the comments if you're still here watching this video at this point. Over here next to my head is another video that you can check out. Hit that up, or the link to subscribe to the channel. Anthony Fantano, Such Great Heights, Chris DeVille, interview forever.